Okay, I was saying the introduction was important. I'm not a specialist in digital narratives. I am an editor. I have been looking at that world and experimenting with it. But I would like to talk to you about some ideas and some examples and case studies with regards to these models of storytelling that are coming in the future. And a question first. Why is it that for the past 125,000 years we have been storytelling? Why do we tell stories to ourselves? Anthropologists say that when we learned to dominate fire, three things happened. The first was that we found the way to keep warm, the way to cook our meals, and also the dominion over fire coincides with the initial of oral tradition. And what happens there fundamentally is there are stories. Tomás Eloy Martínez says we tell stories because they make us more human. So when we speak about storytelling, we're not really speaking only about the new technological fashion, but we're thinking of the fact that in 5 or 10 years, what will be the fundamental tool through which we're going to tell stories. In the end of the 19th century, novel was the format. Nowadays, TV series seem to be what keeps the most concentration of talent when it comes to narrative. And it is quite possible that in one of these formats that we will see today, in 3, 5, 10, or 15 years, they will become one of those formats that we will use to storytell, to feel more human, as Tomás Eloy Martínez says. 2,400 years ago, Aristotle, in Poetics, established the basic principle of a story: beginning, introduction, and an end. And this is quite developed. This is the way a story becomes a story. And for 2,400 years, for better or worse, we have told each other stories under this prism. The new digital narratives threaten some of these principles. For example, the linearity, the equivalence between story and narrative. A story may have different narratives, and also the place of the author and the place of the audience or the reader. 120 years ago, when films were created, the first experiences were documentaries, a train arriving at a station, people leaving a factory, and when the fiction arrived, what happened was theater plays were filmed. Those were the first experiences in film. Our digital narratives nowadays are basically film theater. We are still in the infancy. We're trying to replicate with many of these ways of telling stories that are the legacy of our history. We will now see some examples of some interactive documentaries that began as a juxtaposition of elements: a video, a text, a picture, a graph. And in the last few years, they've tried to find a way, an interface that will allow us to learn that history in a more organic way. For example, the first example I want to share with you is being done by the Australian public television. It's called I'm Your Man. It is a narrative story of 4 boxers where it allows us to know the story of these boxers by going in their own world. I'm going to show some videos. They're not very long, but they're very necessary. The crux of the scene is the training area for boxing. What happens is that through a technique, they show them to box, and you can move your mouse to move their arms, and the video tells you if you're doing it right or wrong when it reads the scrolling of the mouse. Now I did it wrong, see? You can see it. Then you go straight to the fights, and it recreates 4 historic fights. where during the training you can hear the boxer and you experience what the boxer experienced, knowing, and there's been an extraordinary job to do with the way they tell the story and the ambient sound, and that's why it would be great to listen to it with headphones. And that there's a small detail to do with gaming, where to go from one chapter to the other, we must defeat the opponent. This was done with real boxers. They acted. There are very interesting videos of how this was staged, this whole process. And it allows us to introduce somebody to the world of boxing with the ability. This is, for example, is a fight, and with the mouse you can respond to the tactics that you have trained for according to the opponent. The second example that I would like to show is Raising Barriers. It is from the Washington Post newspaper. There are very few interactive things that have gone so far. Washington Post has posted these 70 interviews. This is an interactive special program. 1 month was dedicated to doing this. One of the interesting things it does is to propose a way of going through it with these bars. It is scrolling. You can see videos, testimonials, maps, photo galleries. It's not a juxtaposition of these elements, which was the first thing that big media did when we talked about interactivity. It goes pretty far. And it also shows one of the problems in this genre. This can be done by the Washington Post because they have enough muscle, capability, resources, and talent and time to do it. But it is still a discipline that is experimental. And to create this genre, it has won some awards. The next thing we're going to see is very interesting. It is even more efficient than the one before. It's called I Spy, and it allows to go into the alliance of 5 countries, and they do a digital follow-up of the security. Let us see a trailer. There are 5 chapters. It's a 5-part documentary. Each of these chapters have a video, a main video, and a kind of rotation with other links. And each video has the complete footage. Each video is 7 minutes long, and each one of these points have sub-chapters, small videos with testimonials, and they're like marginalia. They are like footnotes of this project. It becomes part of that interactive. It is very easy to navigate. They have found something with regards to the user interface that works. The next example that I want to mention, because I'm not going to show it because tomorrow morning Rosemarie Lerner will be here, and she is the creator of this. Kipu is an amazing project. It's done in Peru. During Fujimori's presidency, there was 300,000 women were sterilized, as well as 20,000 men against their will. And the Kipu's project put a hotline so that men and women could leave their testimony. And at the end, they are organized in this way. It's very interesting. It is very simple, and you can go and see this experience, and you can be exposed to this experience through this testimony. You can hear the voices on the phone telling you what happens. For me, this is part of the documentary genre based on audio, and it is an experience that is very simple but very effective. Now we are going to talk about an audio case that's also very interesting, made in Australia by the public TV. It is called My Grandmother's Lingo, Lingo for language. It is there is a jargon in Australia which is spoken by only 3 people. Languages that die in the world are a global phenomenon, and this documentary is one of the grandchildren creates a project to let her grandmother's lingo survive. It is very poetic. There is a voice-off, and there is a very interesting detail that I will tell you now. The graphic design is also beautiful.
Mala is my grandmother language, and I didn't get the chance to learn Mala in school, but now I really want to learn my grandmother's lingo. When I started hearing my grandmother speak Mala,
El documental está compuesto por 5 partes.
The documentary consists in 5 parts. Each becomes unblocked when you learn a word from that language. So when each chapter is over, the documentary suggests you learn one word of that lingo. You need to activate your mic. It explains how it is pronounced. You do it. If it's okay, you get okay. If not, wrong. And then it explains to you what it means. That word interrelates with the following chapter. And in some way, it allows your voice. It's like a word opener. It's very beautiful. It's a 10-minute experience I absolutely recommend. My grandmother's lingo.
Open sesame.
It's kind of an anecdote, but I believe it has something to do with this new digital narrative. There's Manuel Vartal, a Spanish designer who 10 days ago on his vacation in Marbella posts a Twitter saying, this is weird, somebody is following me, I think. And he started posting a whole series of weird situations that were happening to him, and that resulted in suggestions, alerts, like I'm in Marbella too. And 48 hours later, he disclosed that this was a fiction story crossed by actual situations he was documenting there in Marbella using a number of languages. There's somebody who compared him with Orson Welles' World Wars, but it's very far from being there. And he ended having 15,000 followers as opposed to the initial 400. But interesting is when you read the succession of twists over those 48 hours, there's a plot. There's a nice story there. So all these tools, these languages, these technologies do not work or are useless if there's no great story underlying. And it has to do with the capacity of creating suspense of what we know for this 10,000 years of story, what makes a good story. First experiences as regards comic. The comic and the black novel have been there for a number of years. But I think 2 of these experiences are interesting to note. Number 1 is Cash Cow from Al Jazeera, where the story of a woman is told. This video has no audio. And her father exchanged this woman for 6 pieces of cattle. The story tells the plight, the 3 years that this woman needs to go back home to understand her story. And this comic or black novel is a mixture of illustrations, of photography, and it uses a very interesting language. And this had a very interesting level of digital audience. Let's jump on to an example I like myself. It was June the 2nd this year when the New York Times published the full edition made up 100% comics, no text. The full edition was comics and black novel, and of course a lot of non-fictional content, journalism beyond any specific story. So I think this is a very interesting time for this blend of languages and of formats, and also of ways in which we are telling stories. This is a time for experimenting. Let us move on to the, in my opinion, most interesting experience. This is Do Not Track. Again, a documentary purporting to expose the user to the experience of all the digital information that is involuntarily disclosed on our digital paths. I also recommend you to follow the experience. You don't need the sound here. There's a main character leading the story and telling that he gets up every morning and sharing on Twitter or Facebook lots of information, that maybe he is a bit irresponsible, but he does it like the rest of us. And he explains that anyway, you're sharing a number of information that is unintentional. So in less than a minute into the video, this guy says this is these are his Twitter pictures, this is his home. And again, less than a minute into the video, the audio says, I know you live X, that the temperature there is this, here I get it, that you are accessing from a Mac computer, and every time these images change, if you enter from the same IP, it tells you this is a PC or whatever. It's a very immersive experience, and this first data comes without questions being asked. But then it asks you, where do you get your news? It naturally goes to the video chapter. This is exceptionally well done because there's no friction between audio and video, and there's programming behind that makes video or the experience each goes be different and unique. This is a kind of choose your own adventure without choosing it, actually. This is just coverage, but because of your computer point and time of the day is disclosed. Do not track. I recommend you. It may be a bit scary because it does expose that information you deliver almost involuntarily. And this is another turn of the screw. This is called Let's Make It Count. This is also another turn of the screw of choose your own story. This is very experimental. This was made by a French company. This starts with this introduction telling you that 4 French guys spent a week in Los Angeles, and that on the last day they have decided to spend the last days on their own. So there was a plot, screenplay behind the scenes. At that point, they're deciding who takes the car. And At some point, the video proposes these four classical options. Classical in terms of choose your own adventure, who to follow. The technological development of this story lets you follow all four at the same time, in real time, listening to the voices of one or two or all of them.
Wait.
There are hints on what each story is about. You need to choose. The first thing is that four stories are simultaneous. This is a mouse which activates audio for a specific story. Now you can hear the one from this story,
I think it's up there. Well, it is, but you know, the season.
or from this one. I can click and just see the story I choose, whereas the others are occurring simultaneously. I can go back to the grid with the four stories.
Thank you so much. All right.
I can see the audio. This drives you crazy, really.
One more. Do you mind?
But the video lasts 10 minutes. When the mouse is on this area, all four stories are audible at the same time. This is the part that drives you crazy. But of course, the plots of all four stories have connections. Some characters appear in one of them and then in the other one. I don't think this format will result in many spin-offs or that it be replicated a lot, but I think industry and the art of narration does need this type of experiment. Any of us could spend half an hour researching, going backwards and forwards, and the key, all four stories are interesting, well built, 4 minutes, 23 seconds. Now, we'll discuss what I think is the area for the most innovative exploration in terms of new narratives, and that's the art of games. This is something like the great-great-grandparents of digital games. 1976, this is a father programming game for his daughter. This is role-playing, but the first that accepts natural language. And here you can see parallel stories that occur as a result of choices made and of the things entered by the one who follows it. But let us have a look at this experience, all the delicate duplicates. According to the experts, this has pushed the game borders. Basically because during its creation, no classic programmers were involved, but cross-functional team of writers, designers, and cinema directors. This is quite a complicated story. We're going to see this with audio as well. Here, there's the death of not close relative, and the daughter starts interacting. At points, it resembles Stephen King's works. The atmosphere is quite suffocating, but it has got many awards in all the reviews. But what should be noted here is the capacity to create a world and to make a psychological novel or world move forward. And you can go through this in different ways. This is one of those games in which there is no beginning or no end. You just inhabit it. And the experience is absolutely immersive. What is clear is that behind these plots, there's, again, story creators, people who know how to tell, how to create a plot that can evolve, that can move forward, that can make characters develop, and which in which the main character, that is the user, is one of the characters, him or herself. It is then disclosed. This is the type of experiments I consider are pushing the forwards of narrative and exploration. The following one is more classical, and here there's already a format that is established and successful audience-wise, and this is the adaptation of bestsellers to the world of games. The Pillars of the Earth. There are versions in every platform. And interesting here is that this model has become another link in the production chain, book, cinema, video, and here the stories are customized. The main characters are taken, the main points in the story are taken, but there's a different creative development, new characters, new subplots. And most people who play these games have not read the novels. It's like people who see the adaptation of the film but have not read the book. It's an adaptation of stories which already exist, and this is a genre that is very well established in terms of choosing one thing over another, or finding the path to X, or starting a fire. These are small challenges which are already classical in this games platform. And last, I would like to share with you the most beautiful game I've seen. I'm not an expert, as I told you at the beginning, but Journey is another game who has been awarded many prizes. The question here is very interesting. At the beginning, you are a person. You don't know, a man, woman. You're in the middle of the desert. No instructions, no training, no vein. You just need to start walking. What would seem to be just wandering becomes a discovery and self-discovery path. This is really beautiful from the point of view of its art direction. And what is especially interesting about it is that it lets two users meet, but it's always up to two. There's no possibility of meeting more than two. You cannot intercommunicate. And when you start interacting in the action, you find out that you can do things together. There are very interesting moments in it. It may take up to 2.5 hours to go through it fully, but this is a world with plots and subplots. And at every instant, and this is the comment I found the most interesting, the player discovers that there's a director behind, a god, an author. And like with good novels, in which characters seem to be driven by a force that is more powerful than themselves, that they are pushed towards a destiny, the same thing happens in this game. And this is also the result of great authors who can tell great stories with these tools. These types of games are very interesting. They have resulted in a genre of videos which are the ones going through games and showing you the games, but these are videos that last 2 hours, 2.5 hours, available on YouTube. These are people that get exposed to stories followed by others. And to conclude, what does the new digital narrative need? These narrative genres are at the very beginning. This is like film drama. The cinema took 30 years it took 30 years for the cinema to discover its own language. And this is what is happening in this world. So what I think is missing is, number one, authors. And I mentioned authors because truly successful and interesting examples are made up by more than one author. There are writers, designers, filmmakers, journalists, in the case of documentaries. This is teamwork. And up to 50 years ago, the creation of these stories were the result or the creation of a single author. And to me, this is a major challenge. We need more experimenting. 4 simultaneous stories are not here to last, but I'm sure we're learning something from there. Purposefully, I have not brought any reality examples from VR or AR, where there are examples with the mobile, but the platform that will rule is still virgin in terms of experimentation. For non-fiction, AR is doing interesting things. We have seen some of them and we'll continue to see more tomorrow. In fiction, everything is to be discovered. And the last but not least, there's still need for audience for these projects. Most projects are not sustainable from the point of view of the audience. There are no millions of people wishing to or willing to see these things. Most of us prefer to sit back and go into Netflix. Why? Because this is something we all know. We know what to expect when in a Gypsy chapter, a great series, somebody tell us a story in 50 minutes. But we need more tradition. We need to build those user interfaces that anticipate what we will encounter and that create that audience. If 125,000 years ago we told stories and we continue to do so for the next 125,000, there's something interesting that Tomás Eloy Martinez said, why they make us more human. According to him, if we read data, for example, on a hurricane destroying a city, and we just read the cold data on the toll of people or household with no power, etc., something happens. But if we know the story of a specific person, a first and last name, what happened to that person, what they experienced, what they felt, exposure to that story does not only convey information but also emotion, and that makes us more human. And I think these narrative experiences are in their early stages, but they deserve the effort of the pioneers and of the industry to make them become the carrier for this passion and knowledge. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chani.
Can we have a bit of light on stage, please? Curatorship, indeed. I did a bit of research. That was wonderful. I'm so happy that in this new phase of your life you have time to do these kinds of things and to give us your opinion. There is something that you mentioned. Low audience, they are pretty artistic, they are narratives that may be journalistic at times. How can we be able to develop these type of experiences? We are now experiencing, exploring, seeing what we can discover. These are all like conquerors who are looking for new ways and new paths. We should create spaces to be able to create that. Do you know of spaces in Argentina that are experimenting like this? No, there aren't any. When we talk about cell phones backed by millions of dollars, it took them years to to agree on a user interface where the home button is at the bottom and the cameras are at the top on the right of the device. Apple really was the pioneer in installing a format for everybody. The level of our experimentation is what allows the construction of a genre and the option of an adopting a format. This happens in the market, and what it needs is a space to be able to experiment and develop, because these are hours of flight. Nobody in the labs is going to be able to decide what format will be successful or what the audience will be swayed by. It is the experience of the users that will determine that. Thinking a bit about the way of doing these things, we all know the National Film Board Canada experience, where this is one of the main sponsors for these type of things. They decided to become leaders in digital journalist narratives, and they invest. Maybe governments should or could invest in these type of experiments that will ultimately get somewhere. Somebody has to back it. It's very important to do it. The private sector is not always able to, especially not SMEs. I showed you the Canadian experience, Make It Count, the one with the 4 videos, and some of them were also part of the Canadian project. I was mentioning the cell phone. There are big companies behind them. There's a real market there. And behind this capability of telling stories, there is a social value to reach more people. If it took film 50 years to begin to find its own language and to convert a flashback or a flash forward, it will take us time for these narratives, for these narrative models. Let us go to the floor and see if anybody wants to ask a question. Any questions for Chani? First of all, I must apologize. I hate people who ask for the mic to simulate a question, to then express their own opinion, but that's what I want to do. I congratulate you. It's quite generous to work so hard to illustrate your point, because most of us want to see tangible examples, since we cannot produce them due to myriad reasons. I don't agree and respectfully disagree with you. I think the format of the 4 screens may be the one that will become leader. About 6 years ago, in an international market, a project for 2 screens of 2 perspectives for a couple that was splitting up, and the author had given us this duality, did not happen because there was not 2 channels. There were public or private companies that wanted to do on one channel at the same time follow Martin's story and then Paula's story on the other channel. When it comes to a separation of a couple, this is a great idea, and I will go and tell the author this now, to say you can do this on this platform. I am so thankful. About your comment, our experience generally with very good stories is the enjoyment is like a dream. And the basic trouble is that most of these formats interrupt that dream. And therefore, it is a different modality of approach by the audience. In non-fictional content, they can accelerate quicker and they can achieve more global objectives, but fictional formats, to me, are very experimental yet. I had a fantastic time in this half an hour that I played with these 4 screens, but it was a strange experience when it comes to an immersive dream within a story. That you were saying that one of the factors that should be developed is the audience, to have an audience who is habitually sitting down and not doing much. What does this new narrative offer for the audience to actually be eager to participate? I have no idea what we could do. I don't know. The truth is, I am 48, and therefore I don't quite know what happens in the head of somebody who is 20, like my son. Yes, I do believe that the level of availability and interruption goes up as the age comes down, and therefore I like to lie down on a sofa and be immersed in somebody's story. But it is quite possible that a 20-year-old would be more attracted towards feeling that they have the joystick and the control for that story and that they can move it according to their whims. Since I work in newsrooms, these new narratives, in order to compete, could be applied in how to tell news stories. And especially, may I insist in the fact that it is difficult to know what a 20-year-old feels, but since that is the future, the young 20, 30-year-old who look at everything through Twitter, cell phones, they read news on the cell phone. How can we compete and be up to date and tell news stories the same way as before, different, or through stories or transnet media? I think the news category is quite difficult one because it is immediate, it is fast, and these things take a lot of time. Some kind of other journalistic content could be used for these kind of formats, and they could prove useful. But if you want to understand how our digital path can release our own information to third parties that do not track experience, is really fascinating, because you can experience. It is like having a mirror on that screen, and they're telling you what I know about you without you telling me. And that is kind of eerie. And I believe undoubtedly there are opportunities to narrate content, information, and stories, but I think it is more difficult for the news category, where if I want to find out something quickly, the SMS is still the most effective way forward. Okay, we are going to close here with Chani. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to be with you on stage.